Hold on, madam. I'll get you safe.
A cowboy rescued a woman from snow, then discovered she was carrying his future child. The howling blizzard almost drowned out the desperate cry for help, but Kellen Hawk Callahan's ears, attuned to the sounds of the wilderness, after years on the range, caught the faint human sound beneath nature's fury. It was December 1000, 875 the untamed reaches of Wyoming territory, and the 8-year-old rancher had been foolish to venture out to check his cattle in the gathering storm. But something about that decision would alter the course of his life forever. Kellen pulled his horse to a halt, the animal's breath creating plumes of vapor in the frigid air. He tilted his hat back, squinting against the driving snow, and listened. There it came again, a woman's voice, weak but unmistakable. "Hello," he called out, his deep voice carrying over the wind. "Where are you?" He dismounted and led his horse forward slowly, following the sound until he spotted what looked like a partially buried wagon, its canvas cover torn and flapping violently in the wind. The team of horses that had pulled it were gone, likely broken free and fled or perished in the cold. A faint cry came again, and Kellen saw the movement. She was tied there, her hands and feet bound. An old, cruel joke by some low-life travelers. "Help!" The voice was weaker now. Kellen hurried forward, his boots crunching through the deep snow. He found her huddled beneath what remained of the wagon's cover, a young woman with long, raven-black hair and skin pale with cold. Her clothes were woefully inadequate for the Wyoming winter, a sign she wasn't from these parts. He quickly drew his hunting knife and cut the thick ropes binding her. "Madam, can you stand?" Kellen asked, kneeling beside her. "My ranch is about 3 miles from here. We need to get you someplace warm." Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of a deep, dark brown, like the rich soil of the plains before a summer storm. I don't know if I can," she whispered. Without hesitation, Kellen wrapped his heavy coat around her and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but there was a solidity to her that suggested she wasn't as fragile as she appeared. He settled her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, holding her securely against his chest. "Hold on, madam, I'll get you safe." The journey back to his ranch was treacherous. The snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, and the wind bit through his clothing now that he'd sacrificed his coat. But Kellen was no stranger to hardship. He'd built his modest spread from nothing after the war, working as a trail hand until he saved enough to buy his own land. Cold was just another enemy to overcome. By the time they reached the simple but sturdy log cabin he called home, the woman had fallen unconscious, her breathing shallow. Kellen carried her inside and laid her gently on his bed. He quickly built up the fire in the stone hearth until the room glowed with warmth, then turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. As he removed his coat from around her, he noticed her dress was soaked through. Medical knowledge picked up from years on cattle drives told him he needed to get her warm and dry immediately. With methodical efficiency and as much propriety as the situation allowed, he replaced her wet clothing with one of his flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks, then covered her with every blanket he owned. Only when she was settled did he take a proper look at her face. She was beautiful, with delicate features and full lips now regaining their color. He guessed she was in her early 20s, and despite the circumstances, there was a peacefulness to her expression as she slept. Kellen pulled a chair next to the bed and settled in for a long night of vigilance, determined that this stranger wouldn't die on his watch. Dawn broke with the storm still raging outside. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Wyatt had dozed off briefly but woke to find a pair of deep brown eyes studying him intently. "You saved me," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. Kellen straightened in his chair. "Anyone would have done the same, madam. Coyote Moon," she offered. "And I'm not so sure about that. There's plenty in this world who'd have left me to the mercy of that storm." "Kellen Callahan," he replied with a nod. "And I suppose you're right about that. There are hard men in these parts." He stood and moved to the stove. "Can you manage some coffee and broth? You need to warm up from the inside out." "Thank you," Coyote Moon said, attempting to sit up. She winced suddenly, her hand going to her abdomen. Kellen was at her side in an instant. "Are you hurt? Did I miss an injury?" She shook her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "No, I'm not injured. She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "I'm with child." The revelation struck Kellen like a physical blow. Here he'd been thinking only of saving a lone traveler, not realizing he'd rescued 2 lives. "How far along?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. "About 4 months," she replied, her hand protectively covering her belly. "It doesn't show much yet, especially under all these blankets." "The father?" Kellen began, unsure how to phrase his question. Coyote Moon's eyes hardened. "Is not in the picture. I was traveling to my cousin's home in Laramie. She's a widow with a boarding house. Said I could help her run it." Kellen nodded, not pressing further. Whatever her circumstances, judging her was not his place. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until the storm passes and you're strong enough to continue your journey." Over the next 3 days, the blizzard continued unabated, effectively trapping them together in the cabin. Kellen slept on a pallet by the fire, giving Coyote Moon his bed. They established a routine of sorts. He tended to his livestock in the barn during brief respites in the storm, while she, regaining her strength, insisted on cooking meals from his limited supplies. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat before the fire, sharing a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Coyote Moon finally spoke of what had brought her to this desolate stretch of Wyoming in winter. "His name was Elias," she said without preamble. "We met in Omaha, where I worked as a seamstress. He was charming, handsome, said he was passing through on business." She stared into the flames. "I believed him when he said he loved me, believed him when he promised marriage." Kellen remained silent, letting her words fill the space between them. "When I told him about the baby, he disappeared. Later, I learned he already had a wife back east." She laughed bitterly. "My parents disowned me. The shame of an unwed daughter with child was too much for their standing in the community. My cousin Martha was the only one who offered help." "That's a hard road for anyone," Kellen said finally, "but especially for a woman alone." Coyote Moon looked up at him, defiance flashing in her eyes. "I don't need pity, Mr. Callahan. I made my choices." "Not offering pity, miss," Kellen replied, "just acknowledging strength when I see it." Something in his words seemed to catch her off guard. The defiance in her expression softened, replaced by a tentative appreciation. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, clearly wanting to change the subject. "It seems a lonely life for a man on his own." Kellen leaned back in his chair, considering his answer. "It is lonely at times," he admitted, "but after the war, I crave the quiet. Saw too much death, too much suffering. Out here, a man answers only to himself and the land." "You fought in the war?" She nodded. "Union cavalry. Enlisted when I was 18, fought until Appomattox." "You must have seen terrible things," she said softly. "Yes," he replied simply, not elaborating. Those memories were locked away, only occasionally breaking free in nightmares that left him gasping in the dark. "But that's the past. Now I have this place, 200 acres, 40 head of cattle, a few horses. It's not much compared to some of the big outfits, but it's mine. I work it alone most of the year." "It sounds peaceful," Coyote Moon said, a wistful note in her voice. "It can be hard work, but rewarding." Kellen studied her face in the firelight. "And what about you? Is a boarding house in Laramie what you really want?" Coyote Moon sighed. "What I want and what's possible are different things, Mr. Callahan. A woman in my position doesn't have the luxury of dreams. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here." The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a pristine white landscape under a brilliant blue sky. Kellen ventured out to assess the damage to his property and check on his livestock. Miraculously, his small herd had weathered the blizzard in the shelter of a canyon, and his losses were minimal. When he returned to the cabin, he found Coyote Moon standing on the porch, wrapped in one of his blankets, her face lifted to the sun. "It's beautiful," she said as he approached. "I've never seen such emptiness, yet it doesn't feel empty at all." "That's Wyoming for you," Kellen replied, removing his gloves. "Makes a person feel small and significant all at once." "Your wagon," Coyote Moon said suddenly. "Do you think it could be salvaged?" "My belongings." "I'll head out tomorrow to take a look," Kellen promised. "But I have to be honest, Miss Moon. From what I saw, there might not be much left to salvage." Her face fell. "I understand. It's just, everything I had was in that wagon. Clothes for the baby. The little money I had saved. We'll figure something out," Kellen assured her, surprised by his own determination to help this woman he barely knew. The next day, Kellen rode out to the site of the overturned wagon. As he'd feared, it was beyond repair. The wooden frame splintered by the force of the storm. He managed to recover a small woven basket containing some of Coyote Moon's clothing and personal items, including a worn leather-bound book and a silver hairbrush. He was returning these to his saddlebag when he noticed a leather wallet half buried in the snow. Curious, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a stack of banknotes, more money than a seamstress would likely possess, and a folded document. Unfolding it, Kellen found himself looking at a wanted poster. The face sketched on it was unmistakably Coyote Moon's, though she was identified as Winifred Gladstone. The charge: theft of $5,000 from the First Bank of Omaha. Kellen stared at the poster, his mind racing. The woman he'd rescued, the mother-to-be he'd been caring for, was apparently a fugitive. He should turn her in, or at the very least, confront her with what he'd found. Yet something held him back. Perhaps the memory of her vulnerable honesty by the fireside, or the protective way she cradled her unborn child. With a decision that would alter both their futures, Kellen tucked the wanted poster into his shirt and buried the wallet in the snow. Whatever Coyote Moon or Winifred Gladstone had done, he would give her the chance to explain before passing judgment. When Kellen returned to the cabin, he found Coyote Moon had prepared a hearty stew from his meager pantry supplies. She brightened at the sight of her recovered basket, but seemed to sense his changed demeanor. "Is something wrong?" she asked as they sat down to eat. Kellen considered his words carefully. "Miss Moon, or should I say Miss Gladstone?" The color drained from Coyote Moon's face. Her spoon clattered against her bowl. "How did you—" "I found a wanted poster at the wagon site," Kellen said evenly. "Stole $5,000 from a bank in Omaha." Coyote Moon's hands trembled as she placed them flat on the table. "Are you going to turn me in?" "That depends on what you have to say for yourself." For a long moment, she was silent, her eyes downcast. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite her obvious fear. "Elias wasn't just any businessman. He was Henry Williams, the bank president's son. When I told him about the baby, he offered me money, hush money, to go away quietly. Said his father would disown him if he married a nobody like me." She looked up, meeting Kellen's gaze directly. "I refused. I wanted him to acknowledge his child, not pay me off like some prostitute." "So you stole from the bank instead?" Kellen asked, his voice neutral. "No," Coyote Moon exclaimed. "Henry set me up. After I refused his money, he told me to meet him at the bank after hours. Said he wanted to talk, to make things right. When I arrived, he had a small bag ready. Told me it contained enough to start a new life for me and the baby. I was naive enough to believe him." She took a shuddering breath before continuing. "The next morning, the bank reported a theft, $5,000 missing, and somehow all evidence pointed to me. My room was searched, and some of the money was found hidden in my mattress. Money I never put there. It was Henry's word against mine. And who would believe a fallen woman over the bank president's son? So, you ran?" Kellen concluded. "I ran," she confirmed. "With only what I could carry and the small amount of money I actually had saved, I changed my name, bought the wagon, and headed west. I truly am going to my cousins in Laramie. That wasn't a lie." Kellen studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. He'd become a good judge of character over the years, a necessary skill in the territories where a man's word was often all he had. "I believe you," he said finally. Relief flooded Coyote Moon's expression. "You do? I've met men like Henry Williams. Men who think their wealth and position put them above decency. Men who use others and discard them when convenient. Kellen's voice hardened with old anger. I fought a war against that kind of thinking, though most would say it was about something else entirely. What will you do now? Coyote Moon asked, uncertainty still evident in her voice. Nothing, Kellen replied simply. Your past is your business. As far as I'm concerned, you're Coyote Moon, a woman caught in a blizzard whom I was fortunate enough to find in time. Gratitude shone in Coyote Moon's eyes, along with something deeper that Kellen wasn't ready to name. Thank you, she whispered. Hey, friend, go grab a full glass of water. People often forget to drink enough, and that's actually a pretty serious issue for you. The next 2 weeks brought a temporary thaw, creating treacherous mud rather than impassable snow. Still, travel remained inadvisable, especially for a woman in Coyote Moon's condition. She continued to stay at Kellen's cabin, and gradually a comfortable routine developed between them. Kellen found himself enjoying her company more than he cared to admit. She was quick-witted and resourceful, turning his bachelor quarters into something that felt surprisingly like a home. She mended his clothes, organized his supplies, and even discovered a long-forgotten packet of wildflower seeds, which she promised to plant come spring. You talk as if you'll still be here then, Kellen remarked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Coyote Moon's hands stilled in her lap. I suppose I do, she said softly. Presumptuous of me. Not presumptuous, Kellen corrected. Just unexpected. They fell silent, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Finally, Coyote Moon spoke again. The baby will come in May. I had hoped to be settled in Laramie well before then, but now... She shook her head. The mountain passes will be treacherous until late spring. By then I'll be too far along to travel safely. You're welcome to stay, Kellen said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. At least until after the baby comes and you're both strong enough for the journey. Coyote Moon turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Why would you do that for me? You've already done more than most would. Kellen considered his answer carefully. Perhaps I'm tired of being alone, he said finally. Perhaps I just believe everyone deserves a second chance. As January gave way to February, Kellen's small ranch saw more changes than it had in the 5 years since he'd claimed it. Coyote Moon's presence seemed to breathe new life into the place. She hung curtains in the windows fashioned from an old tablecloth she found in a trunk. She rearranged the furniture to create a small sitting area near the fireplace. She even convinced Kellen to bring home a stray cat he found in the barn, arguing that it would keep mice away from their food stores. Their food stores. Somehow, without either of them acknowledging it, Coyote Moon's temporary stay had begun to feel permanent. It was during a trip to the nearest town, Clearwater, that Kellen first realized how much his feelings for Coyote Moon had deepened. They needed supplies, and though he was reluctant to expose her to potential recognition, they agreed she couldn't remain isolated at the ranch indefinitely. Just stay close to me, Kellen said as they approached the small settlement, and keep your bonnet low. Clearwater was hardly more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. Still, after weeks of seeing only Kellen, the prospect of other human interaction both excited and terrified Coyote Moon. They tied their horses outside the general store, and Kellen helped Coyote Moon down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Her pregnancy was more visible now, her belly a gentle swell beneath her dress. Mrs. Callahan, how wonderful to finally meet you. The enthusiastic greeting came from a plump woman emerging from the store, wiping her hands on her apron. Kellen stiffened beside Coyote Moon, but before he could correct the woman's assumption, Coyote Moon slipped her arm through his. How do you do? She replied with a warm smile. I'm afraid I'm at a disadvantage. Oh, forgive me. I'm Harriet Miller. My husband owns the store. Kellen's been trading with us for years, but he never mentioned taking a wife. She beamed at them both. No wonder we haven't seen him in town these past weeks. Kellen opened his mouth, clearly intending to set the record straight. But Coyote Moon squeezed his arm in warning. Yes, well, "We've been quite busy at the ranch," he said instead, his voice strained. "I imagine so," Mrs. Miller laughed. Come in. We just got a shipment of calico that would make lovely baby things." As they followed Mrs. Miller into the store, Kellen leaned close to Coyote Moon's ear. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Being practical," she whispered back. "A married woman draws less attention than an unwed mother to be traveling with a man who's not her husband." Kellen couldn't argue with her logic, but the ease with which she'd slipped into the role of his wife unsettled him. Not because it was unpleasant, quite the opposite. The idea of Coyote Moon as his wife felt surprisingly right, and that realization shook him to his core. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. As February turned to March, the Wyoming landscape began to show tentative signs of spring. Patches of snow melted to reveal tender green shoots, and birds returned to nest in the eaves of the barn. Coyote Moon's pregnancy progressed, her belly now a prominent curve that she cradled protectively as she moved about the cabin. Kellen found himself increasingly drawn to her, not just physically, though he couldn't deny his attraction, but to her spirit, her resilience, her humor, her unflappable optimism in the face of circumstances that would have broken many. Often he caught himself watching her as she hummed a traditional song while preparing meals or reading by the fire, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. One evening, as a spring rainstorm lashed against the windows, Coyote Moon gasped suddenly and placed a hand on her stomach. Kellen was at her side instantly. "What is it? Are you in pain?" A slow smile spread across Coyote Moon's face. "No, not pain." "Here," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her rounded belly. "Wait." For a moment there was nothing. Then Kellen felt a distinct movement beneath his palm, like a butterfly's wing but stronger. His eyes widened in wonder. That's the baby." Coyote Moon nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He or she has been quite active lately. This is the strongest I've felt, though." Kellen remained still, his hand on Coyote Moon's belly, feeling the miraculous evidence of new life. Something profound shifted within him in that moment, a protective instinct so powerful it nearly took his breath away. "Coyote Moon," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been thinking." She looked up at him, her expression open and vulnerable. "Yes, when the baby comes, if you wanted, you could stay here. I mean, with me." The words tumbled out awkwardly. "Not as my guest, but as Mrs. Miller already believes." Coyote Moon's lips parted in surprise. "Kellen, are you asking me to marry you?" He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly unsure of himself. "I'm making a mess of it, but yes. I care for you, Coyote Moon, more than I expected to, and the baby." "The baby isn't yours," she interrupted gently. "I know that," Kellen said firmly, "but I'd like it to be. I'd like to be a father to your child. Give him or her my name." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "And I'd like you to be my wife, if you think you could care for me, too." Coyote Moon was silent for so long that Kellen began to regret his impulsive proposal. Then she reached up and touched his face, her fingers trembling slightly. "I do care for you," she whispered, "but I need to be sure you're asking for the right reasons, not out of pity or obligation." "Pity?" Kellen shook his head. "Coyote Moon, you're the strongest woman I've ever known. And obligation? The only obligation I feel is to my own heart, which has somehow become tangled up with yours." She smiled at that, a smile so radiant it transformed her face. "Then yes, Kellen Callahan, I will marry you. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." They were married 2 weeks later in Clearwater's small church with the Millers as witnesses. Coyote Moon wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Miller helped alter to accommodate her growing belly, and Kellen wore the only suit he owned, now somewhat tight across the shoulders. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, both of them acutely aware of the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Kellen kissed Coyote Moon with a tenderness that belied the passion he felt, mindful of their audience and her delicate condition. "Mrs. Callahan," he murmured against her lips. "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her eyes sparkling with happiness. The Millers hosted a small reception at their home, where the few residents of Clearwater came to congratulate the newlyweds. If anyone thought it strange that Kellen Callahan had suddenly appeared with a pregnant wife no one had met before, they kept their speculations to themselves. As they rode home that evening, husband and wife now in truth as well as appearance, Coyote Moon leaned against Kellen's chest, his arms around her as he held the reins. "Are you happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she replied honestly. "Are you having regrets?" "Not a single one," Kellen assured her. As April arrived, bringing with it longer days and warmer temperatures, Kellen worked tirelessly to prepare for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from pine boards, sanding each piece until it was smooth as silk. He rode to Clearwater for supplies, soft flannel for diapers, a tiny knitted cap Mrs. Miller insisted on giving them, a special herbal tea the storekeeper's wife swore would ease the discomforts of late pregnancy. Coyote Moon, meanwhile, transformed the cabin's small second room from Kellen's storage space into a nursery. She sewed curtains and a patchwork quilt, using scraps of fabric from her own dresses and Kellen's worn-out shirts. She knitted booties and blankets, her fingers moving swiftly despite her growing fatigue. One afternoon, Kellen returned from checking the fence line to find Coyote Moon sitting on the porch, her face pensive as she stared out at the distant mountains. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Callahan," he said, settling beside her on the bench he'd built shortly after their marriage. She smiled at the name, still new enough to bring a blush to her cheeks. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. Months ago, I was desperate and alone, convinced my life was ruined. Now here I am, married to a good man, about to have a baby who will grow up loved and secure." She took his hand. "It seems almost too perfect." Kellen squeezed her fingers gently. "Not perfect. Real. And real has its challenges." "Like what?" she asked, curious. "Like the fact that I know next to nothing about babies," Kellen admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "Or that we'll need to expand the herd if we're going to provide properly for a growing family. Or that someday we'll have to decide what to tell our child about their birth father." Coyote Moon's expression sobered. "You've thought about that? Of course I have. But we don't need to decide everything today." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "What matters is that we face whatever comes, together." She leaned into his touch. Together, she agreed. That night, as they lay in bed, Coyote Moon placed Kellen's hand on her belly, a ritual that had become precious to them both. The baby kicked vigorously, causing Kellen to laugh. "Strong little one," he commented. "Going to be a handful, just like his father," Coyote Moon said sleepily. The words struck Kellen deeply. He was going to be this child's father, not by blood, but by choice and commitment. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the joy it brought him. "I love you," he whispered, saying the words aloud for the first time, though he'd felt them for weeks. Coyote Moon's eyes opened suddenly, alert. "Say that again." "I love you," Kellen repeated, more confidently this time. "I think I have since I found you in that blizzard." Tears welled in Coyote Moon's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered back, "so much it frightens me sometimes." Kellen gathered her as close as her belly would allow. "Nothing to be frightened of," he murmured against her hair. "I'm not going anywhere." May arrived with an explosion of wild flowers across the Wyoming plains. The ranch was busy with spring calving, and Kellen hired 2 local boys to help, aware that Coyote Moon's time was approaching and he would need to be available when the baby came. Dr. Simmons, Clearwater's elderly physician, had agreed to attend the birth, though he warned them that spring brought its own medical emergencies and he might be called elsewhere. As a precaution, Mrs. Miller had been teaching Coyote Moon what to expect and how to manage if the doctor couldn't arrive in time. On the 15th of May, a day of particular beauty with clear skies and gentle breezes, Coyote Moon was hanging laundry on the line when she felt the first contraction. It wasn't particularly painful, more a tightening that reminded her of the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She continued her task, but when another came just 10 minutes later, she knew it was time. Kellen was in the corral breaking a young horse when he saw Coyote Moon walking slowly toward him, one hand supporting her back, the other cradling her belly. He immediately handed the lead rope to one of the hired boys and vaulted over the fence. "Is it time?" he asked, his heart suddenly racing. Coyote Moon nodded, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I think so. The pains are still far apart, but they're getting stronger." Kellen wasted no time. He sent one of the boys to fetch Dr. Simmons and the other to inform Mrs. Miller. Then he carefully led Coyote Moon back to the cabin, supporting her when contractions made her pause. "Are you afraid?" he asked as he helped her change into a loose nightgown. "A little," she admitted. "But women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I'll be fine." She squeezed his hand reassuringly. Mrs. Miller arrived before the doctor, bustling into the cabin with a basket of supplies and an air of capable authority that immediately put both Kellen and Coyote Moon at ease. "First babies often take their time," she informed them cheerfully as she set water to boil and arranged clean linens. "We could be in for a long wait." She was right. As afternoon turned to evening and then to night, Coyote Moon's labor progressed slowly. Dr. Simmons arrived around sunset, confirmed that everything was proceeding normally, then settled into Kellen's chair with his pipe, occasionally checking on Coyote Moon's progress. Kellen refused to leave Coyote Moon's side, wiping her brow with cool cloths, holding her hands through contractions, and murmuring encouragement. As the hours passed and her pain intensified, he found himself praying silently, fervently for her safety and that of their child. Near dawn, Coyote Moon's labor suddenly accelerated. Her contractions came one upon the other, leaving her little time to rest between them. Dr. Simmons and Mrs. Miller exchanged glances, and the doctor moved to the foot of the bed. "It's time to push, Mrs. Callahan," he instructed. "With the next contraction, bear down as hard as you can." Coyote Moon nodded, her face flushed with effort, her hair damp with sweat. She gripped Kellen's hands with surprising strength as the next contraction built. "You can do this," Kellen encouraged her. "You're the strongest person I know." Coyote Moon pushed with a determination that left her gasping. Again and again, she bore down, following the doctor's instructions, her body working to bring new life into the world. "I can see the head," Dr. Simmons announced. "One more good push, Mrs. Callahan." With a final monumental effort, Coyote Moon pushed, and suddenly the cabin was filled with the indignant wail of a newborn. "A boy," the doctor proclaimed, lifting the squalling infant for them to see. "A fine, healthy boy." Mrs. Miller quickly wrapped the baby in a warm blanket while the doctor attended to Coyote Moon. Then, with a beaming smile, she placed the tiny bundle in Coyote Moon's arms. "Your son," she said softly. Coyote Moon gazed down at the red-faced infant, her expression one of wonder and overwhelming love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Kellen leaned close, his throat tight with emotion as he looked at his son. For that was how he thought of him, regardless of blood. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the same deep brown as his mother's. "He's perfect," Kellen managed, his voice rough. "Would you like to hold him?" Coyote Moon asked, her smile radiant despite her exhaustion. With careful hands, Kellen took the swaddled infant, cradling him against his chest. The baby quieted, seeming to study Kellen's face with solemn intensity. "What shall we name him?" Kellen asked, unable to tear his gaze away from his son. Coyote Moon had been considering names for months, but had waited for this moment to decide. "Zachary," she said. "Zachary Kellen Callahan." "Zachary," Kellen repeated, testing the name. "I like it." As Mrs. Miller and the doctor discreetly cleaned up and prepared to leave, promising to return later to check on mother and child, Kellen sat on the edge of the bed, still holding Zachary. Coyote Moon rested against the pillows, tired but glowing with happiness. "Thank you," Kellen said, his voice low with emotion. "For what?" Coyote Moon asked. "For him, for trusting me, for making me a father." He looked at her, his love evident in every line of his face. "For everything," In the weeks that followed, Kellen and Coyote Moon adjusted to life with a newborn. Zachary proved to be a good-natured baby with a hearty appetite and a fascination with his father's deep voice. Kellen would walk the floor with him at night, giving Coyote Moon a chance to rest, singing old trail songs and telling stories of cattle drives and cavalry charges. By midsummer, life had settled into a new rhythm. Coyote Moon regained her strength quickly, and soon she was back to helping with ranch chores. Often with Zachary strapped to her chest in a sling, Mrs. Miller had shown her how to make. The baby thrived, growing plump and alert, his eyes following his parents' movements with increasing awareness. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zachary asleep in his cradle beside them,
I'll get you
Coyote
safe.
Moon broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Kellen, do you ever think about what might happen if someone recognizes me? If word gets back to Omaha?" Kellen had considered this possibility many times. "I do," he admitted. "But the longer we're here, established as husband and wife with our son, the less likely anyone is to question who you were before. But if they did, then we'd face it together," Kellen said firmly. "You're my wife now, Coyote Moon Callahan, not Winifred Gladstone. I'd stand by you no matter what." She leaned against his shoulder, comforted by his unwavering support. "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone," she said. After a moment, Kellen waited, giving her time to find her words. "That night at the bank with Henry, I did take some money. Not $5,000, not even close, just a few hundred that he gave me directly." She looked up at Kellen, her expression earnest. "I was desperate, and I believed him when he said it was a gift, not stolen. But I've carried the guilt of it ever since." Kellen considered this confession. "You were betrayed by someone you trusted, someone who then framed you for a much larger crime. Taking what he offered doesn't make you a thief, Coyote Moon, doesn't it?" she asked softly. "No," Kellen said with certainty. "It makes you human. We all make choices in desperate moments that we might not make otherwise." Coyote Moon seemed to accept this, her shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. "I want to be worthy of you," she said. "Of the life we're building. You already are," Kellen assured her, drawing her close. "More than worthy." As summer faded into autumn, the ranch prospered. Kellen's careful management had resulted in a healthy calf crop, and cattle prices were strong. For the first time, he hired a permanent hand, a steady, middle-aged cowboy named Frank, who had worked the big outfits but was looking for something more settled as he aged. With the additional help, Kellen was able to spend more time on improvements to the ranch house. He added a proper bedroom for Zachary, who at 4 months was outgrowing his cradle. He built a covered porch across the back of the cabin where Coyote Moon could sit and shell peas or mend clothing while watching him work. He even started construction on a small schoolroom, though it would be years before Zachary would need it. "Planning ahead?" Coyote Moon teased as she brought him a glass of water one afternoon while he worked on the new addition. "Always," Kellen replied with a smile. "Besides, this room might be needed for more than just Zachary someday." Coyote Moon blushed at the implication. They had resumed marital relations after Zachary's birth, and the possibility of more children was something they both welcomed. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A brother or sister for Zach." As if on cue, Zachary gurgled from his blanket spread beneath a nearby tree where he was practicing rolling over, a skill he'd recently mastered and seemed inordinately proud of. "He's growing so fast," Kellen observed, setting down his hammer to join Coyote Moon in watching their son. "Hard to believe he was ever that tiny bundle you placed in my arms." "He adores you," Coyote Moon said, her heart full as she watched Zachary's face light up at the sound of Kellen's voice. "As do I." Kellen pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that still had the power to make her knees weak. "The feeling is entirely mutual, Mrs. Callahan." Winter came again, but this time the Callahan household was prepared. The larder was full, the woodpile stacked high, and the cabin snug against the cold. Zachary, now 7 months old, was crawling everywhere, keeping both parents constantly on alert. Christmas approached, bringing with it Kellen's favorite memory of their first year together. He had ridden to Clearwater for supplies, leaving Coyote Moon and Zachary at the ranch, with Frank nearby in the bunkhouse. When he returned, he found the cabin transformed. Coyote Moon had decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. A small tree stood in the corner, adorned with paper stars she'd cut and painted. The delicious smell of gingerbread filled the air, but it was Zachary